Good evening. Good evening. I'm Mark Updegrove, the director of the LBJ Presidential Library, and I want to welcome you here tonight as we enjoy an evening with renowned sports writer Frank Deford, moderated by Sports Illustrated editor Terry Mcdonald. Tonight's program is co-sponsored by the Texas Program in Sports and Media and is part of the McGarr Symposium on Sports and Society, whose mission is to bring to life a robust and interactive conversation about the role of sports and media and its impact on American culture. Before I bring on Mike Kramer, the director of the Texas Program in Sports and Media, who will introduce our guests, I want to make you aware of the brand new logo for the LBJ Presidential Library. Can we see that? There it is. We are unveiling this for the first time this evening. The new logo is part of a new day for LBJ, which we'll see throughout the year, culminating in our opening of a newly renovated core exhibit on the life and legacy of our 36th president in December. Tomorrow will mark the grand opening of our brand new store, the store at LBJ, which is twice the size of our old store and full of brand new merchandise, much of which includes the new logo. Now, all friends, of course, enjoy a 10% discount at the store. And I will tell you, I just went in there for the first time today, and it is spectacular, truly so much so that I don't want my wife to ever visit. Now it's my pleasure to bring on my friend Mike Kramer. Mike is the former president of the Texas Rangers and Dallas Stars and an expert on all aspects of the sports business. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mike Kramer.
Thank you, Mark. I'll wait for our guests to be seated. Thank you all for coming, and thanks not just to Mark personally, but to his staff and all the folks here at the LBJ Presidential Library. We've done a couple of events with Mark, and they just get bigger and better, and look forward to doing many, many of these type of events in the future. I couldn't think of a better partner, so thank you again, Mark, and to all the staff as well. Tonight, I'm only going to speak for a moment, but I have the distinct honor and pleasure of welcoming a couple of iconic figures. Even though this is a night about Frank Deford, and rightly so, and we have the pleasure of being the world premiere of his new book and memoir called Overtime, and so that's fun. But the person who is here to have that conversation with him is a distinguished gentleman and a tremendous part of the writing community, and has been for a long time. I won't say how long, Terry, but so I'll introduce Terry first. Terry Mcdonald is the managing editor of Sports Illustrated, and I believe is now the longest serving editor of Sports Illustrated. Is that right, Terry?
I am not. That would be Andre Laguerre.
Well, you'll get there though, right? All right, I thought we could get him over the top. Terry is actually being honored himself next week, being inducted into the AFSCME Hall of Fame, which is the highest honor that editors can receive. And so, Terry, congratulations on the induction next week. Tremendous.
Thank you very much.
Terry's also been a tremendous help to us. We have a couple of interns in New York now for 2 semesters from the College of Communication, and it's through the efforts of folks like Terry that has allowed us to put 2 students in New York for full semesters, and the response has been tremendous by the students who have been able to do that. So thanks, Terry, to you and your staff. It's been a tremendous help for us. Terry's also a distinguished editor and has edited the works of folks like Hunter Thompson and Tom Wolfe. In addition to editing Sports Illustrated, has edited other magazines such as Rolling Stone, So I'm not sure he'll sing tonight, but he certainly knows those who could. So Terry, thank you for being here. Now the person who we're going to have the conversation with, Frank Deford, I probably know as much or as little as you know, which is probably a lot, about the career of Frank Deford. He's been an iconic writer for Sports Illustrated for many years, has been involved in, I think written, now I should have known the count and I don't remember the number of books, but double-digit number of books in addition to Overtime, which he is premiering here tonight. He's I think one of the most beloved figures in America in terms of his writing, his commentary on NPR. Everyone seems to know who Frank Deford is, and everyone likes to listen when Frank speaks. Certainly we do, and I think you'll enjoy the conversation tonight. So I welcome our two distinguished gentlemen, Terry and Frank, and can't wait to hear the conversation. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you, Mike. It's great to be here. This crowd is thrilling. For us, for me, this book was a kind of a special challenge. It was one of those books that I read very slowly. Buzz Bissinger, I think you all know, wrote Friday Night Lights. In reviewing it, said Deford is the best there is. And that's what this book proves. When I finished it, I just wanted to put it up to my forehead, because in it is a kind of a roadmap for what I've been doing for the last 10 years. So this is a special and challenging assignment for me tonight to get more of this out of Frank. And we have no rules here. We decided that we were not going to discuss what we were going to discuss. We were going to act like we were professionals and let it rip. So it's about to rip. I was struck very early when you were describing your entry into the world of sports writing. You said that at the time, sports writing was still in somewhat of a netherworld. And you went on to say, I got in just before the sun came up. Now, like many things that you have written, this is intriguing and compelling, and I'm not quite sure what you're saying.
First of all,
yeah,
just let me say, the reason this book exists is because of Terry Mcdonald. He said to me one day, I got an idea for you. And I said, what's that? And he said, I want you to write a little bit about what it was like when you first came to Sports Illustrated in the 1960s. And I said, okay, looking back. And that worked so well, then Morgan Entrekin, the editor for Grove Atlantic, came and said, you ought to turn it into a whole book. And I said, but I gave all the good stuff to Terry. There's nothing left over. And it was my wife who's here tonight who said, no, I've heard all that stuff. So there is a lot more. She didn't say I've been bored with all that stuff. She was nice enough to say that. And so it's really thanks to you, Terry, that
well, Frank,
the book exists.
I just got to point out that when you filed that story, you filed somewhere around 22,000 words, and I had asked you for 7,
yeah.
So you were halfway to the...
Yeah. But anyway, you asked about The Sun Comes Up.
Yeah, what was going on?
Sports writing, I won't say it was nefarious, but it certainly was looked down upon in many respects, and had been for a long time. Sports writers wrote differently than other writers. We were always called scribes, and we wrote in a convoluted way and used different language. Jonathan Yardley, the great critic for the Washington Post, said that old-time sports writing was like reading like a bad dream from Sir Walter Scott. And it didn't get a whole lot better. And not only that, sports writers tended to be homers. I mean, they even named a stadium in San Diego after a sports writer. Can you imagine that today? Nowhere in the world would you do that. And there was a lot of under-the-table payments. I mean, there was a lot of crookedness in sports writing. If you had a boxing match coming to Austin, well, I shouldn't say Austin, or anywhere, you would slip a little money to the sports writer, to the sports editor. It was that kind of business. It was just a little bit shady. And I came in at that time when it was becoming respectable. And I must say, a large part of that respectability was because of the creation of Sports Illustrated in 1954. That gave it a cachet that it had never had before. Now, the sun was up. I came in 8 years later in 1962, and it was becoming a little more respectable profession.
Okay, can we talk for a minute about what that was like for you? You have told me, and it in here a little bit, that there's nothing in the world as satisfying as being the kid. The kid. The youngest one in the room. And Frank, you were.
I was. And it's a glorious feeling. And here I was, allowed to come into the salon where all these older gentlemen gathered with not their cigars and their brandy, mostly their scotch and their cigarettes, which was the preferred booze of the day. And of course, newspapermen and sports writers in general have always, until very recently, been looked upon as hard drinkers. That was sort of part of what was expected. But anyway, to come into that and to be allowed to stand at first just on the fringes, but to hear and to listen and to learn and to occasionally even be referred to. And I was the kid. And what made it all the better was that the managing editor at that time was Andre Laguerre, who he had been de Gaulle's press secretary. He'd been pulled out of the water in Dunkirk. He'd been almost killed in Indochina covering the war there. He was English and French, and he was an extraordinary man. And so to run into an editor like that, your first time out, made it all the more extraordinary. And to be accepted, wow, it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. I grew up real fast. It was I should say this, it was a sort of a misogynistic existence at that time. There were not a whole lot of women around. It wasn't that we were anti-women, it was just that women sort of didn't exist. I mean, they did as women.
Well, there was, by the way, there was a joke that it might be yours, at Sports Illustrated, I heard way before I got there, where they had this, where the ideal Friday night was to go to Runyon's.
Yes.
But they would have Runyon's, a bar in New York. There would be a sign on the door, and it would be sports writers congressing inside, no women allowed until midnight. And then at midnight, the doors would be opened and all the women would come in to worship the sports writers. This was how they thought.
I don't know
about
if worship is the right word. But an anecdote, when I told Laguerre that I was going to get married, we were standing at the bar. I was making $10,000 a year, a lot of money in those days. And he put his scotch down and he said, "Oh, Frankie, that's the worst news I've heard in weeks." A real romantic. And he said, "I'll tell you what, I'll give you a $3,000 raise if you don't marry her." That's 30%. And standing next to him was a guy named Tex Mall, who, from the name, you can tell is Providence. Tex had been married 3 or 4 times at that point. And he said, "I'll throw in 1,000 myself."
These are writers. So I'm going to get serious with you for a second, can I?
But I did marry her.
Yeah. So here's another thing that Andre said to you. He said, kid, it doesn't matter what you write about. All that matters is how well you write.
Boy, that meant the world to me, because I think all of us wrestled with, is writing sports serious? I mean, are you throwing your life away just going to games? What are your grandchildren going to say to you? Did you cover the civil rights? Did you cover Vietnam? No, I was at the Stanley Cup. You know, you worried about that. And he said that to me one night, and it meant a great deal, that all that really counted at the end of the day was how well you wrote something. And from then on, I felt a lot more comfortable writing sports.
Well, I want to try to embarrass you.
Go ahead.
All right. This is what Frank wrote in Everybody's All-American in 1981. He's talking about being a natural. That it is the natural part of being a natural athlete, not that you are capable of performing naturally, but that you are natural in accepting the fact. Frank, right? But the rap on Frank was that he was a natural writer. And this drew many, many reactions, actually. But what I'm most interested in is asking you how hard it was for you.
I knew I was a natural. And I know that sounds vain, but sometimes you are blessed and you're given a gift. And I always follow that up by saying how many natural athletes I knew who blew it, who, because it all came so easy, didn't work hard, didn't build on that natural gift. And so that prodded me, Terry. I knew that I had been blessed and could write. And not many other, by the way, there aren't many other things I could do, but,
Well.
But yes, and I've met a great many writers who were not natural, who succeeded tremendously. So it's not like, well, you've been given the key and now you open the door and go through. There are a lot of people who didn't get that key, who had to bang their way in. And once they got in, they wrote better than some of the guys with keys.
I want to make a suggestion to you.
Okay?
That a lot of those people cared a lot more about the score than you did.
The score.
The scores of the games.
I never wanted to cover the games. I was lucky that I had to for 7 or 8 years. It was wonderful. The excerpt that you used this week's Sports Illustrated is about the NBA. And to have to cover it and to be in the locker room and to, you know, sort of to be not just a kid, but the private first class, to be sitting there and to get to know athletes and to travel and do all that. I'm glad that I had almost a decade of it. But at that point, I knew I couldn't do that anymore. I did not want to grow old as Mr. Basketball, you know, who knew all the facts and all the figures. I never cared about that.
But what happened to you, I think, is that you became more and more interested in the social and political stories around the games. I want to read another part from the book. This is also in the excerpt that's in Sports Illustrated this week. Frank is with the NBA in the early days, and he writes that it was more of an ensemble than a league. It was big. He'll tell you about that. But then he says race was changing things, though, and anybody with even the slightest understanding of the game appreciated which way the wind was blowing. Now, what year is this? This is the early NBA.
The early NBA. It was the early 60s. And as I say, I heard the expression white man's disease, I think, in 1963, something like that. And you could see that this white game that I came into, it wasn't going to stay that way very much longer. And That, by the way, just from a personal point of view, was a great benefit to me that I got to meet and work with black people. I didn't know African Americans. How many of us did? I went to Princeton. There were 750 people in the class. 2 of them were black guys. And that was pretty common, by the way. There was 1 black man on the staff of Sports Illustrated, of how many, I don't know, 100 people or 100 or so.
But then you got close to Bill Russell.
I got close to Bill and to a lot of other black athletes. And it helped, I think, that I was their age. You know, that's one of the ironies of being a sports writer, is the longer you stay in it, the further you move away from the people who mean the most. It doesn't work that way if you're writing politics or religion or anything else, because the mature people are the important people. But I was that age, and so we had many of the same kind of interests. It's the question that the guy that I was closest to, the athlete that I was closest to in my life was Arthur Ashe. And you know, it wasn't that he was black and I was white, it was just we were a couple of guys about the same age trying to make it. But I was very, very lucky in that I did get in when to continue the day. The sun was, it was noontime now. And the sun was shining brighter on a lot of things.
When you read this book, you will learn that in the early days of the NBA, oftentimes the kid reporter was making more money than the power forward. You will also learn that in order that the league was so thrilled that Frank and Sports Illustrated would be there that he would sit in courtside seats with Carol, who he was courting at the time, covering.
And would occasionally get into, you want to come into the locker room at halftime? Can you imagine that today?
I was going to you buying drinks for Russell and the Celtics
Yes.
on your Sports Illustrated expense account.
Yeah, I was very popular. I was never under any illusion that it was my charming personality, though.
But
It was the fact that I could go this at the end of the...
I just want to, there's something about the tone of these stories of the NBA that rings so true, even though what we see in the NBA now seems so far removed from that tone. And I'm thinking about a story you tell in the book about you and Bob Cousy are together long after the league was first integrated. I guess Chuck Cooper was the first.
Chuck Cooper was... There were 2 or 3 black guys who came in at the same time. One was Earl Lloyd. One was drafted first. The other one actually appeared in the first game. But Chuck Cooper was essentially the first African American to play in the NBA. Yeah.
But I'm thinking of the time that you were you were together with Cousy and you were asking him if
Yes.
he.
Cousy, this was when I was doing a story on Russell many years later, and I interviewed Cousy. And Cousy had been, you couldn't have asked for a more wonderful, thoughtful, less racist person. When Cooper, this is well before I came on the scene, I think it was in 1954, they played an exhibition game in North Carolina, and Cooper was not allowed to go into the same hotel with the other players, and he couldn't ride back on the train in the same, and Cousy, of his own volition, went with him. Refused to play, went with Cooper. I mean, this is the kind of guy that Bob Cousy was. But when I started talking to him about this, this is in around 1999, year 2000, he broke down completely. We were at his house in Worcester, Massachusetts, and he just broke down, and I didn't understand why. And he said, "I should have done more. We all should have done more." It was so very touching, because here was the guy who had done the most of any white guy, or as much as any white guy. But it was so tricky, that whole business of integration. And remember, basketball's a small team. There's only 10 guys. I remember when I traveled with the Los Angeles Lakers, I believe this was as late as 1962. It was only the year before that the general manager had decreed that they would not room by race. In other words, white guys and black guys would room together. This is 1961. I mean, it took a long time for this sort of thing to evolve. It was fascinating. So at least, you know, I was part of that. No, I wasn't marching in Selma, but at least I was on the inside of watching young men learn each other.
All right. The book is loaded with that kind of stuff. But it also has, Frank deals with the idea that he's always asked these same questions. Who's the best athlete you ever covered? What's the, you know, what was the most charming moment, whatever. When these questions are asked, he insists in the book that his name is misspelled when someone says Mr. Deford. It's a small F all the time, is the way it should be. But he in the course of talking about these various listing questions, he said something that stopped me kind of cold. He said that Jackie Robinson and Billie Jean King were, without question, going to be seen as having the greatest influence of all American athletes into the horizon. Can you tell us how you came to know Billie Jean and how you saw the arc of her life?
Yeah.
Change.
Robinson was a little before me. But I stumbled into tennis. Tennis was still an amateur sport, and most sports writers looked down on it. Tennis, anyone, tea and crumpets. It was.
Frank's a good tennis player, by the way.
It was a good, it was all still a country club game and all this sort of thing. And, but I'm struggling for any story that I can do, and they asked me to do a tennis story, and I said, sure, I'll do a tennis story. And all of a sudden, I realized, if you do basketball, you go to Bloomington, Indiana, and Lawrence, Kansas. If you do tennis, you go to Paris and London. I may be the kid, I may be dumb, but I'm catching on real fast. And just, by the way, from a very general writer's point of view, people in individual sports are better to write about than people in team sports because they're alone. And you just figure it out. The mere fact that they're playing an individual sport makes them a little bit more idiosyncratic, a little bit more intriguing. That's a great general. Anyway, so I go into tennis, and I'm covering tennis on the side. It's still this amateur or shamateur game because everybody's paid under the table. And here comes this chubby little thing with funny glasses named Billie Jean Muffet, and she changes the whole sport. She was amazing. One of the great compliments I got was years later. She said, "You got it." I was about the best compliment I read. She said, "You got it. Most guys didn't get it. You got it." And I sort of understood what she was doing. She was amazing. She was not only one of the best 2 or 3 players in the country, in the world, Margaret Court, Maria Bueno, herself, and Chrissy, and so forth. She's right at the top. But she's running a revolution at the same time. There'd be a tournament in Cincinnati, and Billie Jean would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and go on the television show and hype it, and then argue with people during the day about women's rights, and then go out and play that night in a match. It was really extraordinary what she did, and we didn't know it at the time, but all that time she was wrestling with her sexuality. And eventually, now fast forward 15 years ahead or so, she was outed by someone, and she, by that time, and had made some bad investments and was broke, and she needed the money and had to write a book. And she asked me to write the book with her, which I took as one of the great compliments. But it was so hard for her. It was so painful for her that she couldn't read the chapters. We would talk, I would write, I would send her the chapter. I didn't know this. And she couldn't even read the chapters. She couldn't bring herself to do it. And such strain. We see, Carol and I see Billie Jean every now and then. She doesn't live far from us in New York, and we have dinner together, and with her longtime partner now, Alana Kloss. And she's so happy. And I remember asking her a little while ago, I said, what do you remember about those days when you were a revolutionary, when you were Betty Friedan in sneakers? And she said, mostly what I remember is how sleepy I was. and that really says it all. And for me to be riding shotgun with her, if you will, while she was leading the women's movement, well, it was one of the great privileges. You don't know it at the time, but it was extraordinary to look back on it.
We've got a couple more, and then I'll open up to some questions. But I want to talk about Frank Deford is a tough guy. His writing is so nuanced and so fluid and so graceful that you do not immediately always see the toughness that runs through it, especially when something about sports offends him. A theme throughout, because he recognizes emperors when they are underdressed, is reflected in this passage. This is at one point, he's talking about the 70s. He's talking about how he volunteered to cover an NC2A convention. You can imagine nothing worse to do than to cover an NC2A convention. I did foolish journalistic things like that occasionally, he explains, but here's what he says. Big-time college sports is, of course, a complete fraud, a fountain of deceit, so every now and then, particularly when I was younger and not entirely jaded on the subject, I would involve myself somehow to seek to shine a bright light on this great American hypocrisy. That's Frank in a bad mood. What about that?
Well, I think that that's still the case. As a matter of fact, I think we're nearer to Armageddon with big-time sports than ever before. I think the NCAA is crumbling. It can't hold together, particularly since there are suits coming down the pipeline, which are going to make it more and more difficult. Now, by saying that, Terry, I'm not suggesting for a moment that big-time college sports are going to disappear. They're not. But I think they're going to be, in the same way we saw tennis become honest. It's indisputable that the football players and the basketball players in college sport have to be paid. You can't have a system where everybody makes money except for the players. If you go back 50 years, there were so many sports in the world that were amateur. Skiing, swimming, track and field, so forth, basketball around the world. And one by one, they became honest. And the only place in the world where we mix up money and athletics and still have amateurism is in American college basketball and football. It's the only place in the world. Everybody else has understood that that's just so hypocritical you can't bear it. And the whole idea of amateurism, by the way, is something of a deceit. It goes back to the British aristocracy of the late 19th century when sports were beginning to bubble up. And if the rich guys could create the ideal of amateurism, then only rich people could play, because the poor guys had to work. And so the whole idea of amateurism is based on this sort of falsehood. And why should amateurism only exist in athletics? Nobody says that some kid in college who sings would be purer if he didn't make money on the weekend. Or why should I be a better writer if I wasn't paid? It makes no sense whatsoever that athletics have been carved out to be amateur. And I think that the days are numbered for that. It'll take a while, but it's coming.
There's so much to cover. I'm looking at the clock. I'm scared. The clock scares me now. I have one more quick thing, and then we'll get to some questions. So Frank has a raucous career at Sports Illustrated, and Sports Illustrated is a writer's magazine, and all of the writers at Sports Illustrated, true to this day, believe that the editors are their friends, but maybe not completely. That they have to somehow get around these writers to do the right thing, to make sure the story is as it should be, to bring forth the color and the texture and the feel to tell the truth. So Frank, after this great career doing that in 1989, goes to become an editor himself, not just an editor, but the editor-in-chief of something called The National, which he did with a man who he calls El Tigre.
Well, first of all, Terry, the most infamous thing ever said about editors was by a newspaperman named Gene Fowler, who I'm sure you've heard of.
Yes.
He said, every editor should have a pimp for a brother so they would have someone in the family to look up to.
Who was your source, though, who said that the best time a sports writer ever had was the 3 years he spent in the second grade?
Yeah, Bobby Knight said that. Yeah. And of course, present company accepted, Terry. Yeah. But yes, I did talk about hypocrisy. A man named Emilio Escarraga, who was then the richest man south of the Rio Grande, and he was called El Tigre. Emilio had a swath of white hair. He was larger than life. He owned Mexican television, and Mexico was an oligarchy, and he was a prime member of it. And all around the world, except in the United States, there are sports newspapers, sports dailies. And Emilio saw no reason why the United States could not have a sports daily too. And so, through a strange bunch of circumstances, he came to me and asked me to be the editor of this new venture. And he had the money, he had the reputation, he was prepared to make it work. And so I slipped the traces at Sports Illustrated, and I think maybe, this was sort of my midlife crisis too. This was a chance to do something entirely different, and I became an editor. I crossed over. And we had a lot of money. Emilio was committed to losing $50 million. He eventually lost $150 million. The problem was so simple, which we should have thought of ahead of time. First, there are 4 time zones in this country, not 1. That made it a problem right away. Getting the scores out. I'm probably telling you more than you need to know. The other thing is delivery. In most countries, which have much better public transportation than we do, people buy their newspapers at a kiosk before they get on the subway, before they get on the bus. Here, we want our paper delivered at 6:30 in the morning, right? Right to our door. And that was just too expensive to do we were like an army which was spread too thin. And I knew we were in trouble 2 weeks after we came out when they couldn't deliver the paper to me, and I was the editor. I was living in suburban New York. It wasn't like I was in the middle of South Dakota.
This was a beautiful thing, like a dreamy thing almost to the people who worked at it, and Frank led it, and they did great work, and it's a very famous period. And the great irony is that all of them, and I've never asked you this, but everyone else I've talked to who knows about it thinks that if it happened today, because of the internet and everything, it would be a great success, thereby putting you at least 30 years ahead of your time.
The only problem is that the internet kills newspapers. We'd have been great for the internet. I don't know if the internet would have been great for us.
Ironies
we
abound.
were fabulous as a creative enterprise.
Yes.
And I'm probably the worst person to say this, but we were a terrific. The writing was great. The graphics were great. Everything about it was great. We just couldn't sell newspapers. It was a terrible, terrible business.
So Frank came crawling back to Sports Illustrated.
That's right. And never to be an editor again.
Can we take some questions? Over here? I can't see. Yes, please.
So if you were to give advice to students who wanted to get into sports writing, what do you wish you would have known as a young sports writer?
Have you all heard that? No. There's a mic back there, but I'll just repeat it. If you, knowing what you know now, what kind of advice would you give to a young sports writer? Besides law school.
Yeah. The trouble is that knowing what I know now is so different from what I knew then. Everything has changed, though. The world has shifted under my feet. 10 years ago, you could have asked me that question, and I would have said, do this, do this, do this. And I could have said the same thing to somebody who wanted to go into radio or television. Today, the world is upside down because of the internet, because of blogging, because so many newspapers have gone out of business. I can't imagine what I would do if I came out of college now. I don't know Terry. So it's very hard for me to say to somebody else, here's what you should do. I do know this, though. Writing, as much as anything, it's easy to define who's good at it. You know, it may be tougher to prove that you're a good salesman or a good dentist or a good whatever. But if you can write, it's obvious. And somebody will give you a job, and I think you can succeed at it. And I will also say this, though I probably shouldn't. Sports writing is the easiest kind of writing.
Moving right along. Sir.
So I've stayed awake nights waiting to ask this question most of my life. I want to know what your opinion is of people who use war metaphors for sports events.
I think it's unavoidable. I mean, after all, it's competition. And so it's a battle. It's a fight. It's a cliche, but it's almost impossible not to fall back on some kind of martial references when you're talking about sports. But when somebody is a hero, for example, when there's no tomorrow, I think that's when we go over the line. And it's particularly true now in a sport like football, where people really do get hurt. And that's where we ought to cut back on that kind of terminology.
Go to the other side.
This is a question for really both of you. Most professional athletes are cast as bad characters, a lot of them bad characters. It's in the paper that they want more money and that they're into drugs and everything. But so many of the professional athletes do so much good work in their communities with foundations, with youth organizations. Why isn't there more focus on what good they do, other than only focusing when they beat their wife, when a few of them, or they get into drugs, or they have an affair or something like that? And I think there's too much focus on the negativity and not the goodness that these gentlemen do and ladies do in their communities.
Isn't that true for movie stars? Isn't that true for rock stars? Isn't that true for politicians? If you just go about your business and you're a good person, it's not news. I mean, unfortunately, news tends toward the negative, doesn't it, Terry?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. We try to do something, we try to do it a lot. We have stories and constant updates of websites of athletes especially whose foundations are doing especially good things. And the Sportsman of the Year is really about that. And we try to hit it as often as we can, but in reality, not everybody is that interested in that, and if you pay attention to the pulse out there, you really want to know the whole story, I think.
What are we reading about now? And we're reading about John Edwards.
Yeah.
We're not reading about the other senator, who was in the Senate when he was from North Carolina. But let me correct one generalization. Most athletes are not bad guys.
No.
I mean, it's an arc. They're funny guys and sour guys. They're nice guys and sweet guys and bad guys and rough guys and soft guys. Athletes pretty much go across the human spectrum. They really do.
Sir.
Mr. Deford, I came here simply on the basis of the knowledge of listening to you on NPR occasionally, and seeing you walk out and seeing the reference to one of your early successes, Bill Bradley, who ventures into the area I'm more comfortable with. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about him as an athlete and a politician, if you feel you can.
Yes, maybe my favorite chapter in the book features Bill, though he is not the featured performer. He's the secondary. He's the character actor in it. It's a wonderful.
He steals it, Frank.
He steals the show, even though somebody else is the star of that chapter. And I've known Bill since he was a sophomore. Actually, I saw him play as a freshman, and I laughed that he was very important to my career, and I've told Bill this often, because when I came to Sports Illustrated and told them that the best player in the country, the best sophomore in the country, was a kid at Princeton, I mean, they all laughed at me. And then he proved me right, and that made me look very smart indeed. But I have nothing but the best to say about Bill. I'm so sorry that he did not win the presidency when he ran in the primaries in the year 2000. I think the world would have been a lot different. I think he's bright. And I also make a point of saying in the book that he's a lot more fun to be with than sometimes comes across. He's a guy with a good sense of humor. I can't say enough for Bill. He's a good human being, and I wish he'd been president of the United States.
Take a question from the.
I want to change the popular question, best athlete. Who are the best characters you met, including guys on your side of the table, but who are the great characters that you met in your job? Not the best athletes,
Yeah,
but
the best characters. Oh, gosh. Al McGuire, the coach at Marquette, I mean, I put him right at the top of the list. You say on my side of the table, there's a famous Texan named Dan Jenkins from Fort Worth, who was one of the great characters that ever existed. Then you get the bad boys like John McEnroe. Boy, talk about a character. There are always a plethora of funny guys around, which is sort of surprising when you think that a funny guy rises to the top of what is a physical. But there are. Earl Weaver, the manager of the Baltimore Orioles. You couldn't get anyone quite like Earl. I'm just trying to go as fast as I can right now. I do a chapter on the light beer all-stars because of all things, I was a light beer all-star. Remember, it tastes great, less filling? And that was filled with characters. That was the idea. Let's go out and get old athletes who are characters. So I was surrounded.
But the funniest guy was the biggest jerk.
Oh, yeah, Rodney Dangerfield. Oh. You know, I tried in this book, Terry.
Not that hard, Frank.
I tried in this book to write about people that I liked. I wanted warm memories, but there were a few jerks that just were such jerks they just forced their way in. And Rodney Dangerfield is right at the top of the list, yeah.
We take one more, I'm sorry. I got a signal. Are we over here?
Thank you. I'd be curious as to your opinion on what will happen in the Roger Clemens trial and what you think should happen.
Ooh. Well, I certainly can't tell what will happen because, you know, who knows what makes a jury operate the way that it does. From a rational point of view, looking at it straight on, it would seem to me that he's guilty of sin. I mean, just all the evidence points in that direction. All of those guys who, at the age of 32 or 33, where throughout history, the physical decline went like this, and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, there was a cadre of them who went like this. My gracious, it just went against all the laws of mankind. And Clemens was one of them. So I think Roger Clemens is guilty, but I would not be surprised if a jury decided that there was not sufficient evidence, in the same way that Barry Bonds kind of skated through and only was caught really sort of with a technicality. I think one good thing about sports today is that I think that the drug problem, though not solved, it's always going to be cops and robbers. It's a lot better off than it was a few years ago.
Could I have the last word here, Frank?
Sure.
I just wanted to say something about that. We do a lot of work following that, and it seems lately, especially in the Clemens case, that the government has so mishandled the case that we're in a whole other place now. And I think that's what happened with Balco, and you know, depending on what, you know, where you stand on you know, medical research and how some of the things that are in fact illegal and make you a cheater in baseball will actually emerge as things that are good for you in terms of living longer and healthier lives. So we're at a funny point here. But I don't really want the last word, Frank.
Well, I would just say in conjunction with that, I think there is so much more interest now in the health of athletes that did not exist. I mean, the idea that we've suddenly decided football's a dangerous sport. My gracious, it's in the last year or two. And one thing I wonder about in the future of sports is how many people are going to let their children play football in the years ahead, given what we know now. How many intelligent parents are going to say, yeah, it's okay, going out and play football? I sort of wonder if football is going down the same path as boxing, which boxing has always been a sport for desperate people. Nobody with any sense goes out and gets their head banged around, and I just wonder whether football has that to face in the years ahead. Sport's not going to go away, but I think whether it's going to be as much of the fabric of American society as it has been, if everybody's neighbor children aren't playing it anymore, it's an interesting question.
I hate that question. We thank Frank Deford.
Thank you.